December 1944, above France. A captured enemy pilot would soon face an impossible order. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Müller prepared for a bullet. His Bf-109 was a wreck in the snow. He was told, "Americans show no mercy." But an enemy soldier just offered a cigarette. Kindness was not in the rules of war. He was a prisoner under the Geneva Convention. Yet he noticed something more than procedure in their eyes. They were watching him, studying him, for a hidden purpose. When your captor shows you mercy, is it a gift, or is it the first part of a test? Tell us where you're watching from, and the current time. We love to see how far these testimonies reach. If mercy in impossible moments matters, subscribe to keep these stories alive. In December of 1944, the air over France was a frozen, unforgiving battlefield. 22-year-old Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Müller gripped the controls of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, his knuckles white inside his gloves. Below, the clouds were torn like gauze, revealing patches of snow-dusted earth. He was alone. His training, his entire world, had prepared him for this moment. Not for victory, but for the end. The voices of his instructors echoed in his mind, sharp and certain. They had shown him posters and told him stories of what happened to German pilots who fell from the sky into enemy hands. They described American soldiers as brutes, men without honor, who would offer no quarter. The official word was simple: no mercy. A pilot's duty was to fight until the final second. Crash, burn, or die resisting capture. These were the honorable options. Anything else was a path to torture. He scanned the horizon, his breath fogging the inside of his oxygen mask. Every shadow, every glint of sun off a distant wing could be death arriving. He accepted it. In the cockpit, a pilot made his peace with endings. The attack came without warning. A violent shudder ripped through the fuselage as cannon shells tore into his starboard wing. The world became a chaos of noise and vibration. The stick fought him, bucking in his hands. Black smoke, thick and oily, poured from the engine, cowling, instantly filling the canopy. His heart hammered against his ribs, but discipline took over. He cut the fuel line, banked the crippled aircraft, and searched for a place to put it down. Bailing out was an option, but the parachute descent would make him a helpless target. He chose the ground. The plane fell from the sky, not like a bird, but like a stone. He fought it all the way down, wrestling for a few seconds of controlled flight. He saw a flat, open field, a meadow dusted with winter frost. It was near a cluster of buildings, too near. He braced for impact. The landing gear would not deploy. The Messerschmitt hit the earth with a deafening shriek of metal grinding against frozen soil. The plane skidded, spun, and snapped its remaining wing before lurching to a violent stop. Silence rushed in, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the wind whistling through the shattered canopy. For a long moment, Karl just sat there, strapped into his seat, his mind a numb void. He was alive. The realization was not a comfort, but a new kind of terror. He unbuckled his harness, pushed open the cracked canopy, and pulled himself out of the wreckage. His legs trembled as he stood on the solid, unforgiving ground. He saw them then. Soldiers, American GIs, running toward him across the frozen field, their rifles held at the ready. This was it. The moment from the propaganda posters. He stood straight, pulled his officer's jacket tight, and waited. He would meet his end with dignity. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the butt of a rifle, the shouted order, the final sharp report of a gunshot. But none of it came. Instead, he heard an unexpected sound. Laughter. Not cruel, but curious, almost amused. He opened his eyes. The Americans had formed a loose circle around him and his wrecked plane. They were looking from him to the crumpled metal, and a few were shaking their heads and smiling. A young private, a farm boy from his looks, stepped forward. Karl tensed. The private reached into his coat pocket. Karl steeled himself, but the soldier wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, shook one loose, and held it out. The gesture was so simple, so human. It shattered Karl's reality. He stared at the offered cigarette, then at the soldier's face. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a weary curiosity. Karl numbly took it. His boots crunched on the frozen gravel as two other soldiers stepped forward to gently, almost apologetically, secure his hands. The shackles were real. The cold steel, a firm reminder of his new status as a prisoner of war. But there were no blows, no insults. This small act of decency was more disorienting than any cruelty he had been trained to expect. He thought to himself, "They should hate me. I am the enemy. Why are they smiling?" He was now one of thousands. In 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe had lost over 16,000 aircraft. Pilots like him were falling from the sky every day. The law was clear. The Geneva Convention dictated that captured airmen were to be treated as prisoners of war, not criminals to be executed on sight. But in the briefing rooms back in Germany, such rules were dismissed as fiction, fairy tales designed to make pilots weak. They were fed fanatical myths of American brutality to ensure they would fight to the death. As Karl was led away from the smoking ruin of his plane, he trembled, and it wasn't from the cold. A quiet, terrifying whisper moved through his mind. Everything he had been told couldn't be true. By January 1945, Karl was a world away from the frozen fields of France. He was now prisoner #31G 2423, one of 3,000 German soldiers living behind the barbed wire of Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The journey across the Atlantic had been a disorienting blur, but the camp was a stark, orderly reality. Rows of simple wooden barracks stretched across the flat, winter-brown landscape, watched over by silent guard towers. He had expected hardship, starvation, and beatings. Instead, he was assigned a bunk bed with clean sheets. He received 3 hot meals a day, served in a bustling mess hall. He was given access to a library and religious services. Red Cross parcels arrived with Swiss chocolate and letters from home, though the words were blacked out by censors. Another captured Luftwaffe pilot in his barracks wrote in a smuggled diary, "We gained weight in captivity. Here, some of the men have even learned to laugh too much." This strange, regimented kindness was the most unsettling weapon of all. It stripped away the enemy he had been trained to hate, leaving only a confusing professional distance. Karl soon learned that his experience was not unique. Across the United States, nearly 425,000 German prisoners were being held in over 700 camps, all run according to the strict rules of the Geneva Convention. This wasn't mercy born of affection, it was policy. The United States intended to show the world, and the prisoners themselves, that a democracy followed the laws of war, even when its enemies did not. For enlisted men, this meant labor on farms or in factories, filling the gaps left by Americans serving overseas. But for officers like Karl, the rules were different. They were not required to work. Their days were defined by roll calls, meals, and an endless, gnawing boredom. He read books, played cards, and walked the perimeter of the wire, staring out at a country he was supposed to despise but had never seen. The propaganda had promised a nation of monsters. He saw only farm fields, distant highways, and guards who treated him not with cruelty, but with an unnerving, impersonal fairness. The lack of struggle was its own form of torment. He was a pilot with no sky, a soldier with no war. Then, one cold morning, everything changed. A group of American officers arrived at the camp. They were not the usual guards. They carried themselves differently, their uniforms crisper, their eyes more analytical. They were from the U.S. Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Unit at Wright Field, Ohio. They were on a special mission. They had a collection of captured German aircraft, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and they needed to know exactly how they performed. They needed to know their weaknesses, their strengths, the secrets hidden in their engineering. Manuals and ground inspections could only tell them so much. To truly understand an aircraft, someone had to fly it. They reviewed the prisoners' files, looking for experienced pilots with clean records. One day, Karl was called into the camp commander's office, along with a handful of other Luftwaffe officers. The American captain got straight to the point. He asked them a question so outrageous, so contrary to the rules of war, that Karl thought he had misheard. "Would you be willing to fly for us?" Weeks later, Karl stood on the tarmac at Wright Field, an enemy pilot in the heart of America's Military Aviation Research Center. He was surrounded by the sleek silver shapes of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, the very machines that had hunted his comrades from the sky. He had expected to feel humiliation, but instead, he felt a surge of professional awe. These were magnificent aircraft. An American captain, a man whose friends Karl might have shot down, walked him over to a familiar shape. It was a Bf-109, his own plane, captured and perfectly repaired. The captain gestured toward the cockpit. Karl was allowed to touch the controls, his fingers finding their familiar places on the stick and throttle. It felt like a dream. He flew that afternoon, under the watchful eyes of 2 American chase planes. For the first time in months, he felt the roar of an engine and the freedom of the open sky. He was a prisoner, yet he was soaring thousands of feet above the Ohio countryside. But as he banked over the patchwork of American farms, a cold guilt washed over him. His comrades were still fighting and dying over a ruined Berlin. His family was cowering in air raid shelters, listening for the drone of Allied bombers. He was here, flying in the sunshine, a guest of his enemies. The letters he sent home were censored, and he wondered if he could ever explain this. If he survived the war, would his country ever forgive him for this strange privilege? This kindness felt too easy, too clean. Perhaps, he thought, kindness is only a trick of war. The news arrived in May of 1945, carried on the camp grapevine, and confirmed by the guards whose posture seemed to relax for the first time in years. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. For Karl and the other prisoners at Wright Field, the announcement brought not celebration, but a profound and complicated stillness. Their mission as test pilots ended abruptly. The Americans no longer needed their expertise. The once urgent work of analyzing enemy aircraft was now just a historical footnote. As they were being processed for transfer back to regular POW camps, Karl witnessed small, unbelievable moments of reconciliation. He saw American maintenance chiefs shake the hands of German mechanics they had worked alongside. One of the US pilots, who had served as his escort in the sky, sought him out, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. "You flew well," the American said simply. "Now go home." There was no triumph in the gesture, only a shared acknowledgement from one pilot to another that the great, terrible machinery of war had finally ground to a halt. The enemy label was dissolving, leaving only men in different uniforms, waiting to return to lives they barely remembered. Repatriation, however, was not immediate. The logistics of sending nearly 500,000 men back across an ocean were immense. For over a year, Karl waited, first in Indiana, then in a camp in Virginia. Finally, in August of 1946, his name was called. He boarded a crowded ship in the port of Bremerhaven, bound for a homeland he no longer recognized from letters or memory. He carried a small kit bag containing a few books, a spare uniform, and the heavy, invisible weight of his experiences. He had been a prisoner, but he had been treated with a dignity that bordered on friendship. Of the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in the United States, nearly all were returned by the end of 1946. Many came home healthier and better fed than when they were captured. They returned with stories of hot meals, fair treatment, and strange acts of kindness. But they returned to a nation in ruins, a people wrestling with shame, guilt, and the trauma of total defeat. The stories they brought back did not fit the narrative of a heroic, tragic struggle. In a country struggling for bread and wrestling with its soul, tales of a comfortable captivity were often met with suspicion, resentment, or a cold, accusatory silence. When Karl finally arrived in his small Bavarian village, he was greeted not by cheers but by stares. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains as he walked down the familiar cobblestone street. Their faces were pinched and weary, their eyes holding a judgment he could not decipher. His mother, Anna, opened the door, her face a mask of grief and relief. She hugged him tightly, whispering his name like a prayer. But later, as they sat in the cold kitchen, he felt the distance. She asked few questions about his time in America. The questions she did ask were practical, focused on food and shelter, avoiding the core of his experience. He soon understood why. Overheard whispers in the market told the story. Returning POWs from the West were seen as soft, even tainted. The ones who had endured the brutal Soviet camps were the true martyrs. The men who came back from America were sometimes called American pets, men who had gotten comfortable while their families suffered under the bombs. Honor, it seemed, was measured now in scars, and Karl had none to show. He kept his deepest secret locked away, the fact that his American captors had not only treated him fairly, but had trusted him to fly again. To speak of it would be impossible. In a community that had sacrificed everything, it would sound like a boast, or worse, a betrayal. It would confirm their worst suspicions that he had collaborated, that he had sold his skills to the enemy. The pride he had once felt in his ability as a pilot now felt like a mark of shame. So he stayed quiet, his extraordinary experience buried under a necessary silence. At night, he dreamed he was back in the cockpit, not in the fiery chaos of combat, but in the clear, calm skies over Ohio. He could feel the familiar weight of the leather seat, see the steady glow of the instrument dials, sense the endless horizon stretching out before him. In the dream, there was no enemy, no barbed wire, only the pure, clean feeling of flight. Then he would wake up to the reality of his small room, the smell of damp plaster, and the profound, aching silence of a story that could never be told. A question haunted his sleepless hours, a conflict that no military order could resolve. Was honor found in resisting to the last man, or was there honor in surviving to see the peace? The silence Karl carried home with him settled deep into his bones. In the years that followed Germany's surrender, he rebuilt his life quietly, piece by piece. He found work as a mechanic, his skilled hands finding purpose again in the familiar language of engines and airframes. He married, had a son, and rarely spoke of the war. He was a quiet, disciplined man, known for his precision and his calm demeanor. He never bragged, never told grand stories of aerial combat. His past was a locked room, and he kept the key hidden. Then, in the 1950 seconds, as West Germany was reborn from the ashes of the Third Reich, a new air force was created, the Luftwaffe. It was to be a defensive force, part of the larger NATO alliance designed to stand against the Soviet threat. They needed experienced men, and Karl, despite the years away from the cockpit, was a natural pilot. He rejoined, not as a combat fighter, but as an instructor, his calm temperament perfectly suited to teaching a new generation. In his new role, the world shifted once more. At shared NATO air bases, he began to see American pilots again. But they were no longer his guards. They were his colleagues. They shared hangar space, drank coffee in the same canteens, and discussed flight mechanics with the easy camaraderie of fellow professionals. There was no mention of the war that had once made them mortal enemies. The past was a ghost that haunted the older men on both sides, but it was a ghost they had all tacitly agreed not to speak of. This unspoken peace was part of a larger global narrative. The United States' adherence to the Geneva Convention had become a powerful tool in the new Cold War. It stood in stark contrast to the brutal treatment of prisoners in the Soviet gulags. America's handling of its German POWs was now held up as proof of its moral superiority, a demonstration of democratic values. Yet, for the men who had lived it, the story was more complicated. Most German POWs buried their testimonies. Their gratitude was a private, often confusing emotion, layered under years of national silence and the need to forget. To speak of American kindness felt like a dismissal of their own people's suffering, and so, the stories went untold. One quiet evening, many years later, Karl sat with his son, who was now a teenager, fascinated by airplanes. The boy was looking through an old book of wartime aircraft, and he pointed to a picture of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. He looked at his father, his eyes full of questions Karl had never invited. For the first time, Karl did not turn away from the past. He began to speak, the words coming slowly at first. Then with a steady, quiet clarity, he told his son about the final flight, the crash, and the circle of American soldiers. He described the paralyzing fear, the expectation of a summary execution learned from years of propaganda. "I thought they would shoot me," Karl said, his voice soft. "Instead, they gave me a cigarette. And later, they let me fly again." His son looked at him, his brow furrowed with the simple, profound logic of a child. "Papa," he asked, "were they your enemies?" Karl looked out the window at the peaceful evening sky, the past and present merging in that single, honest question. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes," he answered, the word carrying the weight of a lifetime. "They were, and they showed me a mercy greater than any my friends ever expected." The final image of his war was not of fire or ruin. It was the hum of an engine, not in battle, but in a strange and silent peace. It was the feel of his hands on the controls, trusted by his captors, on a final flight not into combat, but into an impossible act of grace.